New York City, September 16th, 1935. The Cotton Club. 10:45 p.m. The most famous nightclub in Harlem was packed. Monday night crowd. Wealthy white people from downtown. Gangsters, politicians, celebrities. Jazz music loud. Illegal whiskey flowing. The atmosphere electric with that particular energy that came from mixing money, power, and danger in one room. Dutch Schultz sat at his regular table near the stage. Drunk. More drunk than usual. He'd been drinking since dinner. Expensive whiskey. Too much of it. His face was flushed red. His words were slurred. His inhibitions were gone. And his already violent temper was about to explode in a way that would seal his fate. Across the room, at a table near the back, sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 30 years old, running policy gambling in Harlem, building his reputation, building his territory. He was there for business, meeting with associates, discussing operations, keeping his head down, staying professional. Schultz saw him, and something in Schultz's alcohol-soaked brain decided this was the moment to assert dominance, to remind everyone in the Cotton Club who was in charge, to put Bumpy Johnson in what Schultz considered his proper place. Schultz stood up, unsteady on his feet, started walking across the club toward Johnson's table. His bodyguards scrambled to follow him. Other patrons turned to watch, because Schultz's body language made it clear something was about to happen. Something bad. Schultz reached Johnson's table. Didn't sit down. Didn't ask permission to interrupt. Just stood there swaying slightly. Looked down at Johnson with contempt. And then he spoke. Loud enough that everyone nearby could hear. Loud enough that people across the club stopped their conversations to listen. What Schultz said used the most vile racial slur, used it multiple times, called Johnson that word, called Harlem operators that word, said they were inferior, said they existed only because white gangsters allowed them to exist, said Johnson should be grateful that men like Schultz let him operate at all, said black gangsters were nothing, would never be anything, should know their place. The entire section of the club went silent. People stared, horrified, fascinated, watching this public humiliation. This display of racist hatred so extreme that even in 1935, even in a segregated society, it shocked people with its naked contempt. Johnson didn't respond immediately, didn't stand up, didn't reach for the gun he carried. Just looked at Schultz with absolutely no expression, waiting for him to finish, waiting for the right moment to respond. But before Johnson could say anything, Schultz turned and walked back to his table, laughing, proud of himself, thinking he'd won something, thinking he'd established dominance, thinking he'd put Johnson in his place in front of hundreds of witnesses. He had no idea what he'd just done, had no idea that his racist outburst would trigger a response that would end his life within 6 weeks. Because 3 men witnessed that scene. 3 men who would make decisions that night that Dutch Schultz couldn't survive. Meyer Lansky was at the Cotton Club that night, not at Schultz's table, at a different table with his own associates. Lansky was 43 years old, Jewish, had grown up facing anti-Semitism, had been called kike his entire life, had fought his way up from poverty through intelligence and ruthlessness, and he had rules about how business should be conducted. Lansky watched Schultz's racist rant, watched Johnson's controlled response, and he was disgusted, not moved, not sympathetic in some soft way, disgusted from a business perspective, because Lansky understood something Schultz apparently didn't understand. Racism was bad for business. The criminal underworld in 1935 was divided along ethnic and racial lines, but it functioned through cooperation. Italian gangsters worked with Jewish gangsters. Irish gangsters worked with Italian gangsters. And in Harlem, white gangsters needed to work with black gangsters Because black operators controlled territory and relationships that white gangsters couldn't penetrate. Schultz's public racism threatened that cooperation, made it harder to do business, created resentment that would lead to conflicts, made black operators less willing to cooperate with white gangsters, created a racial war when what everyone needed was racial peace, for profit, for survival. Lansky left the Cotton Club at midnight, made a phone call to Lucky Luciano, who was in New York temporarily, handling business, managing the commission, the organization of crime bosses that Luciano had created to prevent the kind of gang wars that had killed so many people in the 1920s. Frank Costello was also at the Cotton Club that night, sitting with politicians he was bribing. Costello was 44 years old, Italian, but politically minded, diplomatic. He understood that organized crime needed to operate like a business, with professional standards, with respect between organizations, with rules about conduct. Costello had watched Schultz's racist outburst and immediately understood the problem. This wasn't just about Bumpy Johnson being insulted. This was about Schultz creating a situation that would destabilize Harlem, that would make it harder for Italian gangsters to work with black operators, that would damage business relationships that were profitable for everyone. Costello also made a phone call that night, also to Luciano, expressing the same concern. Schultz's racism was becoming a business problem. Lucky Luciano received both calls within an hour of each other. Lansky first, then Costello, both saying essentially the same thing. Dutch Schultz had crossed a line, had created a problem that needed to be addressed. Luciano called an emergency commission meeting for the next day. September 17th, 1935, held at a private location in Manhattan. Present were the leaders of the major families, Luciano, Lansky, Costello, representatives from other organizations, and they discussed one issue, Dutch Schultz. The meeting lasted 3 hours. The conversation was detailed, strategic, not emotional, not about moral outrage, about business, about maintaining the stability that made everyone money. Lansky spoke first. Schultz is creating problems we don't need. Last night at the Cotton Club, he publicly humiliated Bumpy Johnson, used racial slurs, did it in front of hundreds of witnesses. Now, every black operator in Harlem knows that Schultz thinks they're inferior, that he has contempt for them. How do we do business in Harlem when the black operators don't trust us? When they think we share Schultz's racism? When they're angry about how he treats them? Costello agreed. Schultz doesn't understand politics, doesn't understand that we need relationships with black operators. They control territory. They have community support. They run operations we can't run ourselves. We need them. But Schultz treats them like they're nothing. That damages all of us. Makes it harder for any white gangster to work in Harlem. Others at the meeting raised practical concerns. Schultz was also drawing too much attention from law enforcement. His violent methods, his public behavior, his inability to operate quietly. All of it was bringing heat that affected everyone. But the Cotton Club incident was the final straw. The thing that unified the commission, because it revealed something fundamental about Schultz. He couldn't control himself, couldn't be professional, couldn't separate personal hatred from business necessity. Luciano made the decision. Schultz has to go, not just because of last night, but because he's become a liability. His racism makes business harder. His violence attracts attention. His instability threatens everyone. We gave him chances. We told him to calm down. He didn't listen. Now he's done. The vote was unanimous. Every boss at that meeting agreed. Dutch Schultz would be killed. Not immediately. They'd wait a few weeks, make it look like something else. But the decision was made. September 17th, 1935. Dutch Schultz's fate was sealed. What followed was careful planning. The commission didn't rush. didn't act impulsively. They took their time, developed a plan, identified the right people to do the job, waited for the right moment. October 23, 1935, Palace Chop House, Newark, New Jersey. 10:15 p.m., Dutch Schultz was having dinner with 3 of his associates. Business meeting, discussing operations, planning future moves. 2 men walked into the restaurant, professional killers, sent by Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the commission. They walked directly to Schultz's table, pulled guns, shot Schultz and all 3 of his associates, multiple shots, close range, devastating. Schultz survived initially, was taken to Newark City Hospital. Doctors tried to save him, but his injuries were too severe. He died 22 hours later. October 24, 1935. Age 33, one of the most powerful gangsters in New York, killed by his own kind. For being too racist, too violent, too unstable to do business with. The official story was that Schultz was killed because he wanted to assassinate prosecutor Thomas Dewey. That the commission ordered his death to prevent that assassination because it would bring too much heat from law enforcement. That story was true, but it wasn't the complete truth. The Dewey situation was the public reason, the justification that everyone could understand. But the real reason was broader. Schultz had become impossible to work with. His racism, his violence, his instability, all of it made him a liability. And the Cotton Club incident was the moment when everyone realized he had to go. Meyer Lansky spoke about it years later, in the 1960s, to a journalist researching organized crime, off the record, not for publication while Lansky was alive, but documented, preserved, released decades later. Dutch Schultz was talented, was smart about some things, made a lot of money, but he didn't understand professionalism, didn't understand that business requires respect, not because respect is morally good, but because respect is practical. You can't do business with people you publicly humiliate. You can't maintain relationships with partners you treat with contempt. The Cotton Club incident, when he called Bumpy Johnson those names, in front of all those people, that showed us who Schultz really was. Showed us he couldn't control his racism, even when his racism was bad for business. And if someone can't control their worst impulses when those impulses hurt business, then they can't be trusted with anything important. Some people thought we killed Schultz because of the Dewey situation. That was part of it. But the bigger issue was that Schultz had become impossible. His racism made it harder to work in Harlem. His violence attracted police attention. His instability created unpredictable problems. We couldn't keep someone like that in leadership. So we removed him. Was it about defending Bumpy Johnson? Not really. I mean, yes, what Schultz did was wrong, was disgusting. But the commission didn't act out of moral outrage. We acted because Schultz was bad for business. That's the real reason. Business. Always business. Frank Costello gave a different perspective in his own later interviews. The commission had a rule, unwritten but understood. We didn't tolerate behavior that made business harder for everyone. Racism made business harder, made it difficult to work with black operators, made them distrustful, made them less cooperative. Schultz's public racism at the Cotton Club violated that rule, not because racism is morally wrong, though it is, but because racism interfered with business operations. After the Cotton Club incident, we couldn't work with Schultz in Harlem, couldn't send him to negotiate with black operators, couldn't trust him to maintain professional relationships. He'd proven he couldn't separate his personal hatreds from business necessity. That made him worthless for that territory. And since Harlem was becoming increasingly important, and since Schultz couldn't operate there professionally, he became expendable. Bumpy Johnson never publicly discussed the Cotton Club incident, never took credit for Schultz's death, never claimed that the commission had defended him, just continued running his operations, building his territory, working with whoever would work with him, including white gangsters like Lansky and Costello, who understood that business required respect regardless of race. But privately, among his associates, Johnson made his position clear. Schultz thought he could humiliate me publicly, thought he could use racist language and face no consequences. He was wrong, not because I was powerful enough to retaliate, but because smarter people than Schultz understood that racism is bad for business. Lansky understood. Costello understood. Luciano understood. They didn't defend me because they liked me. They defended professional standards because professional standards are profitable. The lesson of September 16, 1935, echoed through organized crime for decades. The night Dutch Schultz publicly used racial slurs against Bumpy Johnson, and 6 weeks later was dead, killed by his own organization for being too racist to do business with. The lesson wasn't about moral righteousness. The commission didn't kill Schultz because they believed in racial equality. They killed him because his racism interfered with business, because professional criminals understood something that Dutch Schultz never understood. You can't make money from people you openly despise. You can't maintain business relationships with partners you publicly humiliate. You can't run profitable operations in communities where you've demonstrated contempt for the people who live there. Racism wasn't just morally wrong, it was economically stupid. And in organized crime, economic stupidity was a death sentence. Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, and Frank Costello didn't defend Bumpy Johnson out of solidarity or sympathy. They enforced professional standards. Standards that said, business comes first. That profit requires cooperation. That cooperation requires respect. And that anyone who can't show respect, even to people they personally hate, is too unprofessional to be trusted with leadership. Dutch Schultz learned that lesson too late. September 16th, he proved he couldn't control his racism. October 23rd, he paid the price. Shot multiple times in a Newark restaurant. Dead within a day. Killed not for being racist, but for being so racist that he became bad for business. That's the real story of Dutch Schultz's death. Not a tale of moral courage, but a story about criminals who understood that profit requires pragmatism, that business requires respect, and that racism, whatever its moral status, is economically devastating. The commission killed Dutch Schultz because he violated professional standards, because he made business harder, because he couldn't separate personal hatred from business necessity, and because in organized crime, unlike in legitimate society, there was a price for that kind of unprofessional behavior, a permanent price, paid in blood. In a Newark restaurant, October 23, 1935, 6 weeks after he called Bumpy Johnson the N-word at the Cotton Club, 6 weeks after Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, and Frank Costello decided that racism was bad for business, and that Dutch Schultz was bad for business, and that bad business had to end.